Hi, I'm Sue. I'm a very grateful member of the Al-Anon family group because today I love an alcoholic. Thank you. I want to thank the board and everyone responsible for us being here. It's a beautiful place. It's wonderful. I want to thank Reno for his hospitality. I got to go in a truck yesterday with 4 alcoholics. And it was great, because you see, what I've accepted about myself today is that I hated a drunk when I got here, but today alcoholics are my entertainment. So it really didn't matter what we did yesterday, even though I enjoyed it, but being in a truck with 4 alcoholics, I was in heaven, man. They even let me talk once in a while. And they even laughed at a couple of things I said. Yeah, and it was great. I loved it. We had a good time. We got to go to a battleground, and it was called the Civil War. It used to be called the Drums House. And there were a couple of craters left where we moved out of, I'll tell you that. And most of them were in the walls. And then we got to go to a plantation. I could fantasize. Well, I was grateful that we didn't have those kind of stairs at our house when the drinking was going on. And you know, it's neat because today everywhere I go and everything I get to do gives me a lot of gratitude, because it reminds me of what I did or what I didn't have to do. Yeah, but I know that I had to do all the things that I got to do in order to get here to you. And the thing that makes me most grateful today is newcomers. I love newcomers. They just, they light up my life. You know, it's wonderful. In our meetings, we leave the last 15 minutes of our meetings for the newcomers to share or ask questions. And we had this lady here a while back that she raised her hand, and we said, you know, you want to ask any questions or share anything? She said, yes, he's gone. And I'm afraid he's never going to come back. And this other newcomer raised her hand. She said, honey, don't worry about it. Alcoholics are like boomerangs. They always come back. She said, in fact, happiness to me is opening the refrigerator door and seeing his face on a milk carton. There was this lady in Al-Anon. Her and her husband had been in AA, and she'd been in Al-Anon for years, and he passed away, and she kept going to Al-Anon, and people would say, why do you do that? He's gone. Why do you need Al-Anon? And she'd say, it's a way of life for me. I need this program. And she wasn't feeling well, and she went to a doctor, and they took some tests on her, and the doctor called her, and he said, would you please come in? I have the results of your test, and I need to give you some bad news and some advice. And she said, oh no. So she goes in there, and she gets there, and she looks at the doctor, and she said, okay, give me the bad news first. He said, well, I hate to tell you this. He said, but we just found out you have terminal cancer, and we only give you 6 months to live. And she said, oh no. Well, what's the advice? He said, marry another alcoholic. It'll seem like a lifetime. We had this little newcomer lady come into our meeting. She's 70 years old. And she came into our meeting. I just love her because she's so enthusiastic and energetic, and I like to stand her next to the young girls and let them watch little Sue. And she's such a sweetheart. And she was saying one night that she had only been in the program for 3 months, and it was her daughter that had gotten her to the program. And she'd gotten there because her landlord was a sober member of Alcoholics Anonymous, and he had been sober forever, and an older gentleman. And she said, I know this program works. She said, I don't have to go bail my daughter out anymore. And she said, I don't have to do things for her that I used to do anymore. But she said, the neatest part about this program is that I've learned to love alcoholics. She said, my landlord's not just my landlord anymore. He's a very special friend, and we have sex once a month. But newcomers teach me a lot, and sometimes they teach me how to 12-step and how to not 12-step. You know, this little gal came into our meeting, and she was all beat up, and she had a black eye and a busted lip, and she looked like I used to look. And she raised her hand, and she started crying, and she shared about. She knew she was the only person that ever took a butcher knife in the shower with her. And I'd just gotten back from a conference like this, and the taper had given me a copy of my tape, and I hadn't taken it out of my person. And I remembered that. And after the meeting, I went over to her, and I handed her that tape. And I said, honey, please listen to this, and you'll know you're not alone. And she said, okay. And so she took that tape, and she came back to our Thursday night meeting, and she drove up in front of it, and she looked at a couple of gals walking in. She said, do you know Sue Drum? And they go, yeah. And she handed them the tape, and she said, would you give this back to her and tell her I'm not that bad? But I'm here to report she's that bad. Yeah, and I get to sponsor her today, and she's a real gift. She went on a trip here a while back to the South, and she got to go visit some old-timers, and she came back, she knew all the answers. These old-timers had shaped her up. And God, I loved it. I sat in those meetings and I listened to her just harangue on our meeting, how we were doing it wrong. The old-timers told her how it was supposed to be done, all this kind of stuff. And then for the next 2 weeks, I got to receive 10th steps on her from everybody else, because she knew how to do it right. And I love her enthusiasm. She just doesn't give up. And she's wonderful, and those are the kind of things that keep me alive around here. Those are the kind of things that keep me centered where I'm supposed to be, to let me know that I'm doing exactly what I'm supposed to be doing. A few weeks ago, we had a 12-step call that went over to this little girl's house, and she's 7 months pregnant. She didn't want her baby, and he had left. Her house was turned upside down. You couldn't walk around in that apartment. Her couch was upside down. And I said, my God, did you guys have a fight? And she said, no, he's already gone. The cops came and he left. And she said, I got to clean this place up before he gets back, or he'll think I went crazy. And I said, I think you did. And she said, the cops told me I can't act like I do anymore, that I'll have to do 18 months. And I knew how she felt. The lights were out and nobody was home. And her mom had been calling her and wanted her to move up to Northern California with her, and I asked some of the girls to go with me to help her pack. And we're in there, and they're packing, and they're asking me, you know, why are we doing this? She's not even going to go to meetings with us. We aren't going to even be able to work with her. Why are we doing this? And I said, there might be a day when she gets in Northern California that she's going to want an answer. And she'll look back and she'll remember, and she won't remember our names or who we were. But she'll know that Al-Anon was there to help her. And that might be the only thing she remembers. Because you see, you gave me a purpose when I got here. You gave me everything you had. And today my only reason for being here and being alive is because I serve my God. In order to keep what I have to give it away, no matter what. I might never ever know what happens to that little gal. But I know that the seed was planted. And there were some seeds planted along in my life that when I finally got to the point that I could hear, I got to hear. Because we can see when we can see, and we can hear when we can hear. And I got to go through my life and wondering when I first got here, what's a lady like me doing in a place like this? Because I came in with a lot of smug and arrogance. And because of the steps of this program and a loving sponsor, I got to look back at my life and see where I came from and what was wrong with me. And today I believe that God knew that I had problems and that I needed help, and he knew that the only way I could find help was to get an alcoholic in my life, because you see, I didn't come from an alcoholic home. came from a very loving home. My father worked in the oil fields, and we lived in western Kansas, Oklahoma, and Texas. And we moved around those 3 states and Colorado many times. I'd go to 6 and 7 schools in the same year sometimes. And I never felt like I belonged anywhere. And I always wanted to feel like I belonged, and I never felt that feeling. And it was called oil field trash a lot, so I never felt as good as. And I hear a lot of alcoholics share those feelings, and I wondered, what's the difference? What's the difference? And what I understand today is that when you live with the disease of alcoholism, you get the disease of alcoholism. And all those feelings that I had before I ever met an alcoholic were ready. They were just ready to blossom when I got involved with the disease of alcoholism. And we finally moved to a little town in the Texas Panhandle, and my folks settled down. When I was 16, my father passed away with cancer. My oldest sister had moved away and had her own home family by then, and that left my mother and my younger brother and I at home. And after a period of time, my mother started dating, and I resented that. And I started staying home and taking care of my little brother while she'd go out to those honky-tonks and dance and party, and I resented the heck out of that. Now, she never asked me to stay home and babysit, never told me to do that. You see, that's just who I am. I believe that pre-Al-Anons are born responsible most of the time. And I was trying to fix it in my house, and after a period of time, I started feeling resentful, and I started rebelling because I'm the teenager. I'm supposed to be having fun, and I started rebelling. I started looking for love in all the wrong places, and I ended up in an unwed mother's home in San Antonio, Texas. And I stayed there for a period of time, and I gave that child up for adoption, and I'm grateful for that. I'm grateful that there was a lady there in my life that told me that God uses people to give other people answers, and that God had just used me as instruments to help someone else have a child. And I was grateful for those kind of answers and that kind of understanding, because at that age I wasn't ready or even near ready or capable of being responsible enough to be a parent. And I went back home, and I started trying to run around with the kids that I'd run around with, and they were no longer fun. They were boring and mundane and childish. So I started running around with my mom and her friends, and they were going to those honky-tonks, and I loved it. They were wonderful. They were fighting and drinking and smoking, and the music was loud. And I thought it was great, you know. I sat there last night and I listened to our friend Don, and I just wanted to beat him up, you know. I would have showed him how to commit suicide, because the people I hung around with were rowdy, and they were doing that stuff, and I loved it. And I remember this one little dance. You know, it was a big Quonset building, and I went there and I watched this cowboy move the room, and everywhere he went something was happening, and God, I loved it. I thought it took a lot of courage to do what he was doing. It was fighting, but it took a lot of courage to do that stuff. And a fight broke out, and he came running past me, and he said, "Honey, let me know when the fight's over." And he ran in the woman's restroom to hide. And like a good potential Al-Anon, I was given direction, and I stood on duty. And when the fight was over, I said, "Okay, cowboy, you can come out now." He came out, and he asked me for the last dance, and usually that last dance was a slow dance, so you could rub up against each other and get ready to go home. And and this was a fast dance, and boy, it just kept getting faster and faster and faster, and we never missed a lick. And God, I loved it. It was like I was in the fast lane downtown right now. He did for me what nothing else had ever done for me. I loved it. And I look back at that, and like my friend Arbutus always tells me, you know, the only difference between an alcoholic and an Al-Anon is the obsession. His is the booze, and mine's the boozer. He did for me what nothing else had ever done for me. He got courage out of the bottle, and I got courage out of him. And he made me feel great. And he called me up and asked me for a date. My mom said, "No, you're not going with him. He's older than you. He's been married before, and he's in trouble all the time." And I said, I don't care. And he came to pick me up, and we went outside, and there's no car. And I said, now wait a minute. And he said, well, you don't understand. I've had a DWI, and I've had my license taken away forever. And I said, no problem. I've never had a ticket, and I got a car. And I knew where to take him. I got him in the car, and I took him to the drive-in movie, and I knew what to do there. You kiss and smooch and steam up the windows. And I sat there in that car with Keith, and we watched the movie. And I can remember sitting there thinking, wow, this must be what it's like to be with a more mature man. And then I remember looking over at him, and he had a 6-pack of beer sitting between his legs that he was more interested in than me. And I remember when I got to my first Al-Anon meeting, and you read that pamphlet, Understanding Ourselves, I had those same feelings that it talks about in there. I thought you guys had been window peeking on me, because it says, what's wrong with me? Aren't I pretty enough? Aren't I smart enough? Why is he not paying attention to me? And that set up a pattern for me that I wanted to be number one in his life. And I started doing all kinds of things to get his attention and be number one in his life. And it was real hard because there was nights that he wouldn't even come pick me up. And he'd call me the next day, and I'd say, where were you last night? He'd say, well, I don't know. Why? And I'd say, because we were supposed to have a date. And he'd say, no problem, I'll come and get you tonight. And I'd say, okay. And then I'd hang up, and I'd be so mad at myself because I was going to tell him what he had done the night before and give him all the stuff. And I'd think, well, I'll show him. I'll show him how it feels to have that knot in the gut and sit around wondering what's going on. And so before he'd get there, I'd try to chug-a-lug a few beers. And he'd come walking in the house, and he'd look at me, and he'd say, well, you're not going. And I'd say, why not? He'd say, because you're drunk. I'd say, well, I go with you when you're drunk. He'd say, I know, you hang out with drunks, I don't. And he was right. And we started dating. He wouldn't do what I wanted him to, and I'd have to throw the keys out of the car in the vacant lot, and he'd have to go look for him and come back and get in the car and give me a black eye. And we'd have to do all kinds of stuff like that. And we did that for 2 years. And he got a notice from Uncle Sam, and we ran off and got married. He went and took his physical, and Uncle Sam didn't want him, so I got to keep him. And shortly after that, his grandparents and I decided what he needed to do was go back to school. Now, he'd been going to school for years, never got a degree, and we knew that I had what it took to make him stay put. If we could just make him stay put, then that's what would do it. And so we moved to Stillwater, Oklahoma, and shortly after that, our little girl Simone was born. And I can remember when they handed her to me thinking, my God, I'm so glad it's a girl. Because, you see, Keith was a drunk, his dad was a drunk, and his granddad was a town drunk. And I knew if we had a boy, that it would carry on the family tradition. I did not know that the disease of alcoholism doesn't care what sex, color, race, or creed you are. It takes you to the gates of insanity and hell, and you don't even have to drink alcohol to get there. And we had that little girl, and we stayed there for a while, and I started back to work, and many times Keith would come home and he'd say, Sue, I need to just go out and have 2 beers with the guys. He said, you're working and paying the rent. My folks are paying for the school. And he said, I just can't handle it. It's too humiliating for me. I just got to go have 2 beers. And I'd say, but when you do that, you always end up in jail and you always get in trouble. And he'd say, I promise. I promise I won't do it this time. You know, and our literature tells us, you know, every time there's a sober period, we think the problem has gone away. And so I'd say, okay. And Keith would be gone for a few hours, and pretty soon the doorbell would ring, and I'd go to the door, and there'd be Keith and a cop, and they'd say, if you keep him here this time, we won't put him in jail. And it's like, why me? You know, everybody's always giving him back to me. Why don't you put him in jail? You know? And I'd have those feelings. And I started feeling like he was my responsibility and that I had to fix all of that stuff, and I took it all very responsible. And finally Keith got a 2-year degree after being there for 4 years, and I took all the credit. You know, I started robbing that man of his dignity early on. And he came home one day and he said, babe, he said, you've been going to those honky-tonks, you've been drinking out of paper sacks. You know, and a lady like you deserves better than that. And I'm going, right. And he said, well, I want to take a job in California. And I said, no, I'm not moving to California. It's too wild and crazy out there. And he said, but babe, you don't understand. He said, a lady like you belongs out there. He said, do you know you can walk in a restaurant and order a cocktail? You don't have to drink out of paper sacks anymore. And I'm going, yeah. Well, and he gave me this whole bill of goods, and I bought it. And he got busy, and he built this great big wooden box and put it on wheels and sprayed it bright blue, and we put all of our junk in it. And we hooked it up behind the station wagon, and we got our German Shepherd and our cat and Simone and Keith and I in the station wagon, and we headed for California. Now, we had to go through Oklahoma City and get a prescription filled in a baggie at midnight. And I didn't see anything wrong with that. And we headed out toward California, and it's like, it's supposed to take about 3 days to get there, but it took us 30. Because you see, it depended on how much Keith drank or what he took out of that baggie as to how far we went, and there was days that we just stayed put. Because you see, I didn't know that I had choices. There'd be mornings I'd wake up and I'd look at him to see how he was, so I'd know how to act or what to do or how to feel. I didn't know what to do until I'd checked him out first, and so there was days we just stayed put. And we finally got to California, and we was so crazy. All the way out there, that dog got so crazy in that car. To tell you what kind of a person I was, we named that dog Shaft. Because I used to tell Keith, I'm going to leave you. I was always going to leave him. And I'd say, I'm going to take the car, and I get all the stuff, and you get the shaft. Yeah, and so that's what we named that dog, because that's the only thing he was going to get out of that stuff. And we got out there, and that dog was so crazy, he'd stand behind the driver's seat and wait on big trucks and chase them to the back of the station wagon barking. And he'd be on top of the cat, and they'd have a dog and cat fight, and they'd get on top of Simone, she'd start crying, and I'd turn around, start whacking and bitching, and Keith would start drinking. And we did that one day at a time for 30 days. You know? And we got out there, and he started working in the oil fields, and he'd go off, and then he'd come home. And he came home one night on a Friday night, and he said, babe, you want to go to dinner? Now, that's what I'd moved out there for, because that's where a lady like me belongs. And I said, you bet. So we hurried up and got all dressed up, and we drove up in front of this really nice brick building, and God, it was a beautiful building. It wasn't a Quonset hut. And it had cocktails on neon signs on the front of it. And it didn't have rosies hanging on a board over the door, or say the Shangri-La painted on the window. And God, it was a nice place. And God, all those feelings came up, and it's like, yeah, this is where a lady like me belongs. And it was wonderful. And we walk in that restaurant, and we sit down, and the waiter comes over, and he said, would you like a cocktail? And I said, you bet. Because you see, if they mix it, you can't get drunk. They only put one shot in it. I didn't know he could have 10 to my 1, and I counted every one of them. And we didn't leave Simone out at all. We ordered Shirley Temples for Simone. And I can remember when they set that first drink down in front of us, and Keith took it, and he said, babe, here's to the good life. And we toasted to the good life, and God, it was wonderful. And I looked around, and I watched those people in that restaurant, and they're drinking out of these long-stem crystal glasses. Now, living in a trailer house and being oil field trash, you never have stuff like that. And if I can just have that stuff, I'll be somebody. And if I can just feel like that, I'll be okay. If I could just feel like you looked, I was always comparing my insides with your outsides. And I sat there and I watched those people, and they were swishing that stuff in those glasses, and they were sniffing it, and I didn't know what in the heck they were doing. But God, they looked good to me. And so he came over to take our order, and he said, "Would you like wine with your dinner?" And I said, "You bet." So pretty soon he came over and he set down those glasses, and it's like, whoa. And I sit there and I looked at that glass, and then he poured Keith a little bit and asked him if it was okay. I said, "What do you mean is it okay? He drank stuff in Oklahoma and had things floating in it. Pour mine." And then they poured mine, and I sat there in all my smug and arrogance, and I swished that glass, and I sniffed it. I didn't know what I was sniffing for, but God, I felt good. Until I looked across the table at Keith, and he's drinking out of the carafe. And I just yell at him, "What are you doing?" And Simone says, "Not here." She slides down under the table, and he looks at me and he yells back, "I'm drinking. What's it look like I'm doing?" And I go, "Now look, everybody's looking at us." And he looks at him, "What are you looking at?" You know, and I said, "Now they are looking at us." You know? And I holler at the waiter, "Come here, bring us our food." And he came over and he said, "No, you're not eating here." And I said, "Why not?" He said, "Because you don't know how to act." And he escorts us out, and I'm thinking, my God, what happened? What happened? 30 minutes, 20 minutes ago, we're sitting there, we're toasting to the good life. And now we're being 86 out of the restaurant. What happened? And I looked around, and it's like I could never come back because Keith's talking to everybody with sign language. What are they going to think of me? You know? And we get home, and I get right in his face. "Don't you ever treat us like that again." And he'd say, "Sue, get out of my face." And I'd take one step closer. "And if you ever treat us like that again," he'd say, "Sue, if you don't get out of my face, I'm going to hit you." And I'd take one step closer, and then the knockdown, drag-out fight would be on. And we fought like that a lot. I'd get right in his face, and he'd always tell me if I didn't get out of his face, he was going to hit me. And one night he had me on the bed, and he was choking the living tar out of me, and I thought, my gosh, if he doesn't let go of me, I'm going to die. And I looked up at him, and he's looking down at me with all the intensity he has. And I'm laying there, and I'm thinking, my gosh, he's not thinking about anything but me. I am number one in his life. I was about to die, but I had 100% of his attention, and it was mine. And so I started those kind of situations a lot because it was the only time that I knew that he was just thinking of me. And we'd have those fights, and then he'd walk off. He'd be done with me. And it's like, you don't walk off from me when I'm talking to you. You don't leave me standing there. I've got all this rage and anger inside of me. My God, what do I do with it? And I'd turn around, and Simone would be standing there, and I'd take the rest of that out on her. Because, you see, alcoholism's a family disease. And I understand that today. And I remember one time I was banging her head against the wall, and she looked at me and she said, "Mommy, I know why you're doing that. You're showing Daddy you can act just like him." And I thought, how does she know? I didn't know that, but our children know the things that go on in the home of an alcoholism home. And we'd have those kind of fights a lot. And it's like Keith would go off, and he'd come back. He'd get enough to drink, and then he'd come back, you know, and we'd have those fights. And one night he didn't come home. And I thought, God, he can't treat me this way. He can't go off and leave us like this. And I started thinking, oh, God, please let him die out there. I don't ever want to see him, God. Just please let him die. And I started crying, and I thought, oh, no. God, please bring him home. God, please just let him come home. Don't let him get hurt. And I cried myself to sleep. And I woke up the next morning, and Keith still wasn't home, and I got mad as all get out. And I went in, and I got Simone up. I said, come on, Simone, we're going to go look for your dad. Now, I didn't know where to look for him. And it's like, well, I'll start out at this after-hours club that him and I used to go to. Maybe he's still down there. It was about 12 miles from our house. So I went down there, and 2 blocks from there, I looked over at this house, and there's Keith's pickup sitting over there by this house. And I thought, damn him. There's motorcycles all over the lawn at that house. And by that time, Keith had become a biker, and I was the most afraid of that image. It was the meanest of all. And I thought, I'll show him. He can't treat us like this. And I said, come on, Simone, we're going to get even with your dad. And I took the keys to the pickup out of my purse, and we went over to that pickup, and I drove that pickup 2 blocks from that house. And then we walked back to my car, and I drove that car 2 blocks in front of the pickup. And then we drove back to the pickup, and I drove it 2 blocks in front of the car. And it only took me 4.5 hours to get both of those vehicles home, but I did it, and I felt so good. And I was a good mom. I didn't leave Simone by herself in either one of those cars. She walked every step of the way with me. And we was at home, and gosh, I felt so good. And the phone rings. And I pick it up, and it's Keith. And he said, babe, come and get me. God, I felt good. I said, no, you have one of your buddies bring you home. He said, I don't know what you're talking about. And I said, you're over there in that house with those Hells Angels, and you're drinking, and you're shooting, and you're over there with them. You just let one of them bring you home. He said, I don't know what you're talking about. He said, I'm in jail. I said, jail? How did you get in there? That's my job to put you there. You can't go there without me. And I got so mad. And so I hung up, and I told Simone, I said, okay, we got to go bail your dad out. So we went down there, and I did the same thing I always did. I wrote a hot check to bail him out. And I thought, but I ain't taking him home. I wasn't going to get him this morning, and I ain't going to get him today. So just let him get home the best way he can. And so we went home, and a few hours later, the doorbell rings, and I went in the door, and it was Keith. And he always did the dumbest thing. It's like he always introduced himself to me as if I never knew him before. You know, I'd say, what do you want? He'd say, this is Keith Drum. I live here, you know. And I'd say, no, you don't. Not anymore. He said, Sue, please let me in. And I'd say, beg. And Simone would start crying, and she'd say, Mommy, don't make my daddy cry. Don't make my daddy cry. Robbing that man of his dignity. And he'd get down on his knees in our front yard, and he'd beg to get back in his own home. And after I thought he had enough, I said, okay, you can come in now. And he started to come in the house, and he looked back in the driveway, and he said, oh, by the way, honey, thanks for bringing my pickup home. And I wanted to die. I hadn't done that to be nice, you know. I did everything I could to make him feel bad, because I always felt bad. It's like yesterday when we was riding around, we saw a chain gang over there on the highway. You know, we started laughing, and Reno said, what's so funny? And I said, Keith used to have to do those weekend things on the freeway picking up the trash, and I'd ride around until I found his crew, and I'd go by and I'd go, honk, honk, you know, there's your dad, you know. And it's so funny, I don't know about newcomers in your area, but the newcomers that get to my meeting, when they say they're tired, I understand. It's a lot of work to find a drunk out there. And sometimes it takes you all day. Sometimes you get there just as they're leaving, and God, that's disappointing, you know. But I used to do things like that all the time. And Keith fought with guns. You know, and guns were always going off in our house, and they scared the tar out of me, because they go off and shoot things you don't want them to shoot. So I picked up a butcher knife, and I started fighting back with my butcher knife. Because you see, I'll show you. You know, and it's like we'd stand toe-to-toe with that gun and knife. He'd put his gun right on my nose, and I'd stick my knife right in his stomach. And he'd say, if you don't shut up, I'm going to shoot you. And I'd say, you go first. He'd say, what do you mean? He said, if I shoot you, you're dead. And I said, I know, but when the bullet hits me, it knocked me backwards, and the momentum will make the knife go forwards, and we'll both die at the same time, so go for it. Yeah, he'd look at me, and he'd say, you are crazy. And I was. He came home one night, and I was getting ready to give him the what fors, and it's like he passed out on me 2 minutes into a 2-hour conversation. Now, when I'm mad like that, you don't ignore me. And I got so angry, and he had passed out on his stomach. And I took that butcher knife, and I just started stabbing him all over his back, saying, God, please let me do away with this. God, please, just let me do this. And I was just stabbing him all over his back, just praying to God to help me. I didn't know that this that I wanted to get rid of was the disease and the insanity of the disease of alcoholism. And then I looked at him and I thought, my God, what am I doing? What has become of me? What has happened to me? Because I always blamed it on to him. And here I am trying to kill my husband. And I laid down and I cried myself to sleep. Next morning, Keith woke up and he goes, my God, what's wrong with my back? And I looked at him and I said, well, I don't know. I said, let me see. And he turned around and I looked at his back and I said, you've been drinking all that rock gut whiskey. You've broken out with acne of the back. I said, but don't worry about it, honey. I'll get the rubbing alcohol and I'll fix it. And I loved it. I loved it. We'd had a fight one night and I fell down and I got the whole side of my face kicked in. And I thought, I can't live this way anymore. And you see, I had no answers left. You know, I'd poured out booze, I'd filled it up with water, I'd bailed him out of jail. Yeah, I'd done all those things that I could. I thought, I can't live with it anymore. I'd called lawyers. Yeah, I'd run away. I was always divorcing him. We took turns leaving for the weekends. And it was Simone's job that when we'd leave, her and I'd leave for the weekend, she always had to have the money. And I don't know today how Simone accumulated all that money. But she always had enough money for a motel. Yeah, because, see, alcoholism's a family disease. And I used to feel like, you know, he's part of her responsibility, you know. And I made that child responsible for things she should have never been responsible for. And we'd get in those motel rooms and I'd be sitting there crying. And a little 10-year, 11-year-old girl sitting there with her arms around her mommy saying, Mommy, it's going to be okay. That's the disease of alcoholism. My child knew more than I knew. I was so caught up in the obsession of making him not drink or stop drink or whatever I could do that I didn't know as much of what was going on as my own kid did. So that day I went to the lawyer and I walked in and he looked at me and he said, my God, what happened to you? And I said, my husband and I had a fight. He said, do you fight like that all the time? And I said, no, only when he drinks. And he said, do you think he's an alcoholic? And I said, I don't know what one is. He said, it's people that can't stop drinking. And I sit there and I told that lawyer everything that I had tried to do to make him stop drinking. And he looked at me and he said, if you love him, why don't you take him to Alcoholics Anonymous? And I said, I don't know what that is. And he said, it's a place where people go to stop drinking. And I said, okay. I had an answer. I had one more answer. You see, I understand today that every Al-Anon has to hit a bottom, just like every alcoholic. And as long as I had one more answer, I wasn't powerless. I had the power. And so I went home that night, and I told Keith that I'd been to the lawyer. And I said, he told me if I loved you, I'd take you to Alcoholics Anonymous. And he looked at me with all the sincerity he had, and he said, babe, I thought it had come to this. So I called a man in AA today, and he said, there's a meeting tonight just right over here by our house. I didn't know that he had been to court and he was on a court card. I wanted to think that because he loved me, he could quit drinking. I took the disease so personal. And I said, what time's the meeting start? He said, oh, I think it starts about 8:30, and it's over at 10. I said, okay, great. So I hurried and I fixed dinner, and we got around there, and he went over and laid on the couch, and Simone and I hurried up and did the dishes, you know, and I watched that clock. 8 o'clock, I went over and I got my butcher knife and I went over at Keith on the couch and I jabbed him and I said, "Get up." He said, "What for?" And I said, "We're going to go to that Alcoholics Anonymous meeting." He said, "I don't think I want it." I jabbed him again and I said, "I think you do." And so he went out and he got in the car with me and I took him over to Alcoholics Anonymous and we drove up there and I said, "What time's the meeting over?" He said 10. I said, "Okay, dude, I'm going to tell you something. You come out of that door for 10 o'clock, I'll gut you." Now, when I got to Al-Anon, you told me I couldn't keep a drunk sober, but I did for 4 months sitting in that parking lot every Monday night with my butcher knife. And the sad part about that story is there was an Al-Anon meeting going on in that church the exact same time, the exact same night. But you see, there wasn't anything wrong with me yet. And as long as I had answers, I wasn't powerless. And I had to do all the things that I always had to do. And the next 4 years of our life was real hell. And a lot of things happened in that home that you only tell sponsors. A lot of things happened in that home that I know you know about. And I had to do all those things, and it was like, I used to call our folks and report Keith every time he'd go on a big bender. And I called his folks one day and I got his stepmother and she said, "Honey, you are so young." She said, "If you can't leave that man, why don't you go to Al-Anon?" I said, "What is that?" She said, "It's a place where people go that love drunks." And I said, "How do I get him?" She said, "Call information." So I did, and I called him, and they said if I'd hang up, they'd have a lady call me back. And so I said, "Okay," and it seemed like forever, and this lady called me back, and she said, "Honey, if you'll just go to a meeting with me, we can help you." And I said, "No, you don't understand. If he'll quit drinking, I'll be okay." And she said, "Please take down my phone number. There might be a day when you need some help." And I said, "Okay." So then when Keith would go on those big benders, instead of calling our folks, I'd call this Al-Anon lady, and I'd say, "He's doing it again." And she'd say the same thing to me, "Honey, please go to a meeting with me." And I'd say, "No, you don't understand. If he'll quit drinking, I'll be okay." One day I was talking to her on the phone, and Keith walked in, and it scared the tar out of me, and I slammed that phone down, and he came over to me, and he said, "Who was that?" I said, "It was Al-Anon, and if you don't stop drinking, I'm going to call him again." And it's like, we didn't know who you were, but we were scared to death of you. And I did all the things until I knew one day I couldn't do it anymore. And I hope I never forget the last drunk in our home. Because you see, I feel and I know today that if I forget who I am, I might return. And I don't want to be that person because, you see, I don't know without this program how to stay out of people's faces. I don't know how to not do that. This program is a daily program for me. And I can't do those things anymore, and thank God for the service in this program. You know, the H&I panels. I get to have a panel at a woman's prison out at Chino. And I love going in there. Because there's women in there that because they're in there, they're in there because of a hymn. They're in there because they're just like me. And I remember the first time I shared in there, and this inmate came up to me and she said, "Boy, Sue, I identify with you. I am so like you." And I know they're cons. And so I always ask them, "Were you drunk or loaded when you did what you did to get you in here?" And she looked at me and she said, "No. I stone sober just like I am today." And she said, "I stood in my living room and I watched my husband put a hole in my little 9-year-old daughter's head with a .45. She said, "But I got even. I picked up that gun and I showed him." And I stood there and I thought, but for the grace of God, I don't know. And an inmate told me the other night, she said, "You know, you're meaner than me." here and you're not? And I said, hell, I don't know. I don't know. But as I look back at it and I believe the things that you've told me, I believe the things that sponsors have told me, and I believe these steps. I believe that my God gives me the things that I need for that little newcomer that's fixing to come in the door. I sponsor a little gal that when she got here, she got out of jail. She went to jail for embezzling so he would have money to buy booze and drugs. And I know this program works. She's a secretary for a controller of her company today. And she deposits thousands of cash on a daily basis. Because she loves her God and she loves this program. I know it works. And I love to see those kind of miracles happen. And so I get to do those kind of things in service and 12-step work, so I know that I don't have to be that way anymore. So I don't have to forget of where I came from. Because I don't want to go out that door. I don't want to be normal. I don't know what normal is, but I know what normal was in our home, and I don't want to be normal like that anymore. I want to be sick with and hang out with you guys and do all the things that you do, and laugh and have fun. And to know that there's a power greater than me taking care of me. And because I got to do all the things that I had to do, I got to leave that house. I got to look at that drunk, at that last drunk in our home. And I hope I never forget. And I remember standing there and seeing him do the things to Simone that he'd always done to her, and it's like I saw it for the first time. And I remember standing there thinking, my God, he's not even a good father anymore. I have no excuses left. And I looked at him and a calmness came over me, and today I know it was my God starting to move into my life. I know it was hitting the bottom. I felt nothing. And I looked at Keith, and with a calm voice, I said, I don't love you anymore. But I don't hate you either. And if you got to become a skid row bum, because I thought that's what happened to drunks, and that's what you got to do, but Simone and I ain't going to go any further with you. And we got some things, and we left that house for the very last time. And we were gone for about 4 days, and I don't remember what happened in those 4 days. But I remember that Simone begged me to go back home, that she needed some things. And we went back to that house, and it was dark. And we were afraid that we'd see some things in there because Keith had shot animals in our home, and he was always going to commit suicide. We didn't know what we was going to find. So we were afraid when we walked up to that house, and we went in, and it was dark, and we looked around in the rooms, and we finally got to the bedroom. Keith face down in the bedroom. We thought he was dead, so we kicked him. And Keith looked over, turned over, and he looked at me, and he said, Sue, please help. What an opportunity for an Al-Anon. But you see, I had hit a bottom, and I knew I was powerless. I knew I had tried everything possible to help that drunk. I knew at that moment that my kind of help kills drunks. And I was raised on the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous in this program. My sponsor told me when I was new here that our literature says learn everything you can about the disease of alcoholism, and she said, I don't know a better place to learn it than in the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous, so read it. And I did. And my gosh, when I got to that part of the ABCs, he was talking about me. I'm an Al-Anon, and that book talks about me. I remember standing there looking at Keith, and he's saying, please help me. And that book tells me, No human power could relieve their alcoholism. That's me. I had tried for years to do everything I could for that drunk, and it just got worse. And it says that God could and would if he were sought. Once I got out of the way and I let booze and God do for a drunk what nothing else can do, Keith got to reach out for sobriety for himself. Once I got out of the way, took my God suit off, that drunk got to help himself. And he got up and he went to the phone. I told him, no, I can't help you. The hardest word I've ever said to that man. And he went to the phone and he made some phone calls for himself. And we had to fight with a gun and knife one more time, and it seemed like forever. And the doorbell rings and I go to the door and there's a little shriveled, gray-headed man standing at the door, and I think, Jesus, why don't they send the big ones on these trips? And I watched the miracle of Alcoholics Anonymous happen in our home. And Jack asked me to go with him to take Keith to a detox, and I did. And we got back home, and an alcoholic sat in the driveway with me, and he told me about me. He told me I was sick and that I needed help. And I said, yeah, you don't understand. And he said, no, Sue, I've seen Keith around AA. And he said, but something's happened and I think he wants it now. But he said, I want to tell you something. He said, I've seen it happen many times, and today I can say I can see that I've seen it happen many times. That a sober alcoholic can't go home to an old idea and maintain sobriety. They'll either end up drunk or they'll have to leave to maintain sobriety. And he said, you need a program so you can walk down this same path of recovery together. Not leaning on each other, two sick people trying to help each other, but two strong people walking down, knowing that when you look over, the other one's there for support. And as you go down this road of life, there's going to be bumps in it, and you're going to come around the gullies. And he said the trick is that when you get out here, you don't run. You grab onto a God that you don't understand. You grab onto a sponsor, and the people are your meetings, and you apply these steps, and then you'll get around the curve. And then you'll go on again. And then one day there'll be another bump. But you'll know because you went through the first bump that the other one's going to be easier. And he said, that's what we have to offer you. And Al-Anon knows how to help you, and you need to go there. And he said, let's go in the house and let's talk to Simone. And he went in there and he told Simone that if she loved her daddy, the only way she could help him was go to a program called Al-Anon. And Simone and I started going to a couple of meetings. Keith came home and he started going to a meeting every night. And I thought that was wonderful. I only went to one a week. And he needed one every night because he was sicker than me. And we went to those meetings and Simone hated us. She'd say, I hate you for making me go. We only had one rule in our home, and that you had to have a program. We didn't care what kind, but you had to have one to live there. Because, you see, we knew that what we were doing wasn't working. And I was willing to go to any lengths to get this thing. After 6 weeks, I went crazy, and I knew that it wasn't working the way I thought it should work. And I needed more. That my kind of Al-Anon needs more. And so I started going to more meetings, because my sponsor told me that I could turn my character defects into assets, and the first character defect I recognized was impatience, and I prayed for patience, and I don't recommend that for anybody. And it's like the more I went, I found out I was greedy, and the more I went, the more I got. The more impatient I was, the more I went, the more I needed it. And I got to apply those kind of principles through a sponsor on how to get a program together for me. And it's so funny, this lady that I asked to be my sponsor, she had 18 years when I got this program 16 and a half years ago. And she was so nice. It's like I'd sit in the meetings and she had all the answers before I ever asked the questions. And she was so loving to me. Until I asked her to be my sponsor, and shoot, I don't know what happened to her. But gosh, they get mean when you ask them to be your sponsor. She didn't care anymore about me once I asked her to be my sponsor. I'd walk up to her and I'd say, what do I do about this? She'd say, what do you want to do? And I'd tell her and she'd say, do exactly the opposite. And I'd say, I don't want to do that. And she'd say, I don't care. And she'd do that to me all the time. And I'd tell her in those meetings, I don't like it here. I was so hostile. I couldn't handle people touching me. Don't touch me. Don't be nice to me. Nobody had ever been nice to me unless they wanted something. And I'd say, what's wrong with these people? Why do they got to touch me and hug me like that? She says, because they just want you to keep coming back. And I'd say, then why in the hell don't they just say that? And she'd say, listen, smart mouth, I want to tell you something. She said, when they put their arms around you and you put your arms around them, then God's follows and you're both embraced in the fellowship of this program and you're safe. She said, in fact, you're going to go to every meeting and collect 8 hugs at every meeting. And I said, I don't want to do that. She said, I don't care. And I started doing that. And God, I got where I loved. I couldn't wait going to those meetings because the people were touching and hugging and they were glad to see me and I was glad to be there. And I was hearing stuff. And I walked up to her one night and I said, you know, I wished I could just stay here. I feel so good here. I don't feel this way at home. And she looked at me and she said, I want to tell you something. She said, if you aren't taking this program home, you don't have one. That's where you got sick. That's where you take this recovery. We don't care if you're wonderful for an hour and a half. You got to take this thing home. And I said, I don't know how to do that. She said, I'll tell you. You're going to go home tonight, and when you get home, you're going to start out with the hugs. When you get home tonight, you're going to hug Keith. And I said, I don't want to do that. She said, I don't care. She said, in fact, you're going to do it, and you're going to call me tomorrow morning and report yourself. So I said, okay. So I went home that night, and pretty soon Keith comes home from his meeting. He starts down the hall toward me, and I think, jeez. Yeah, and he got up beside me. I put my arm around him, patted me, and he goes, what's that for? I said, just for the hell of it, they told me to do it. Don't ask me why. And that's the way we started recovery in our home. It was the hugging and the touching that started it. I'd walk past him and I'd pat him on the shoulder and he'd flinch. He'd look at me, you know. And it took a long time for the trust to start happening in my home. They told me one night, you know, do you still keep that butcher knife under your pillow? And I said, yeah. And my sponsor looked at me and she said, Sue, can you imagine what it would have felt like if you'd ever stuck that in him? And I went, yeah. And she said, I'm going to tell you something. You're going to go home tonight and you're going to put that knife back in the drawer. And I can remember going home that night. Keith wasn't that well yet either, and he always had his gun on the nightstand. And I said, look, I got to put my knife up. If I got to put my knife up, at least put that sucker in the drawer. Yeah, and we started out making deals like that with each other about, I'll be nice to you if you'll be nice to me. Yeah, I'm willing to do this. I'm willing to do that. And I'd tell my sponsor, he never gives me a compliment. I always give him compliments. She said, it doesn't matter. You give back what you give away. It happens at home. If you give it out, you get it back tenfold. And it started happening in our home. I started having to cook too. And I got to make breakfast on Saturday mornings because that's when we were all at home at the same time. And what happened around that kitchen table on Saturday morning is that we started communicating. The only rule we had is that you couldn't interrupt each other when someone was talking. And I got Simone where she started being able to share her feelings in her own home with her mom and her dad. And it got her to become another member of that family, not a parent looking down at a kid. But we all became children of God's. We all were equals in that home because, you see, God has no grandkids. And those are the kind of things that I was taught through the steps of this program. And I was told that I had to write every one of these steps. And I wrote my first step and I gave it to my sponsor, and I had to write the second step and I gave it to my sponsor, and I was sitting in a meeting one night in a Al-Anon club and my back was to the door and the door banged open and this drunk came in there and he started ranting and raving and he got in the wrong room. He was looking for an AA meeting. And after the meeting I went up to my sponsor and I said, "What's happened to me? Am I wussing out? What's happened to me? I've never been afraid of a drunk in my life," and he scared the tar out of me. "What's happened to me?" She said, "I think you've taken the second step. You respect that kind of insanity today." And I thought, whoa, this program's happening. It's happening to me. And because it was happening, I could have respect for that kind of insanity, and I could have respect for the people in my home that were trying to work a program for themselves. I never asked Keith to stay home and watch TV. I was glad to see him going to AA meetings. I loved it when he was in AA, and I still do. And I can remember when guys started asking him to be their sponsor, and he'd sit on the phone and he'd tell them the things that he should be doing in his own home that he wasn't. And I'd call my sponsor and I'd say, "He's on that phone and he's telling them the things to do, but he ain't doing them himself." And she said, "Well, what are you doing?" I say, "What difference does that make?" And she said, "Are you doing the things that you're sharing in meetings? Are you doing the things that you're telling newcomers to do?" And I'd say, "Well, most of the time." And she'd say, "Well, so is he." And she'd say, "Get your eyes off of him and on yourself." They used to tell me that all the time. And I'd say, "Well, what do I do when he harangues on me?" She said, "Agree with him." I said, "You're kidding me." She said, "No, agree with thy adversaries quickly and let them be on their way." So one night we was at home, we was having a fight, and I thought, I'm going to try this deal out. And I looked at him and I said, "Thank you for pointing that out to me. I'm trying to work on that." God, his jaw fell clear to the floor. And I thought, wow, you can get even working a program. This is wonderful, you know. And God, it was things like that that started working in our home. And I got to the third step and I said, "I don't understand. How can I tell the difference between my will and God's will?" And she said, "It's real simple. Yours hurts." And that's the way she talked to me. She had to keep it simple. She said this program was so simple and that we complicate it. She said it's not easy, but it's simple. And she said you got to give it to your all and you got to do an inventory. So I got the blueprint from Progress and I read that thing and it says, "Do you this and do you that?" And I go, "Yes, no, maybe, sometimes," 65% of the time. And I answered all that stuff and I gave it to her and I said, "Here's my inventory." And she looked at it and she said, "This is not an inventory. An inventory is meant to look at yourself." And she got me right back in the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous. And she told me to take the 4-column inventory that was in the big book. And I got to take all of their inventories in the first column. Who it was, what they did to me, in the third column, how it made me feel. And almost in the third column every time it'd say, made me feel like a nobody, like I didn't count, and like it was disaster. Like all the self-worth was not there. And I got through with that and she said, "Now you got to do the 4th column. What part did I play?" And I said, "I can't do that. It's too hard." She said, "You get down on your knees and you ask God to put the words in that pencil that you need to see on paper, because it's the pencil and the paper that's the magic of this program." And she said, "If you will ask God that, he will help you." So I went home and I got on my knees and I said, "God, please help me look at me. I don't want to be a victim anymore. I don't want to blame that man for that stuff anymore. And I want to see how I can do different to be a good mom." And I got up and I started writing, and it was like a video went in front of me. I could hear Keith saying, "Get out of my face or I'm going to hit you," and I'd take one step closer, and I thought, my God, he warned me every time. He told me to get out of it. He didn't want to do that. I forced myself on him. I caused most of the fights in that house. It was me. And I saw myself with Simone up against the wall, and I thought, my God. And I could see us in a motel room and her hugging me and telling me I was going to be okay. And I thought, my God, it was me. And I got to stand up and claim my feelings and be responsible for me. What a gift. What a gift. I didn't even know I wanted to do that. And it was painful and it hurt. But the scariest part of all was the fifth step. My God, if I tell her. And I went to her and I said, you know, God's always known this, and I know he won't tell anybody. And I know, but if I admit it to you, the jig's up. I can't play these games anymore. And she said, baby, that's what it's all about. You can't keep playing those games and be God's kid. You got to change. You got to do the things that this program says to do through the steps of this program in order to be who you think your God wants you to be. And she let me dump all that stuff on her, and we got through, and she said, make a list of all your character defects that you found in that fourth column. And I did, and she said that was taking the sixth step that I was willing. And she said, now we're going to turn them over, and we're going to turn those character defects into assets. Hatefulness, the opposite of hateful is love. You're going to make a commitment to your God in this program to become a lover. Selfishness, you bet I'm selfish. This program comes first with me. My God comes first with me. You see, I've never had to work on my marriage with Keith since I found you. Because I was told to work on my relationship with my God. And when I'm in good God consciousness, everybody else is okay. Isn't that a miracle? I thought there was so much work. It's only work when I have to trudge and work at it. When I'm in the bad place, I'm in pain, and it seems like forever trying to climb that hill to get toward my God. And then all of a sudden I let go and it's all there like I wanted it to be in the first place. Just because when I got to those character defects, I was willing to give up one more time, one more surrender. And I was willing to say, okay, God, you take the bad and I'll work on the good to the best of my ability. And I've tried to do that on a regular basis. Make that list of the people that I'd harmed. And not to say I'm sorry, but to say I was wrong and I want to change. And that's the hardest part of all. But then the best part of it is that it's exciting because I know because you've told me, and I know that my God works through people. He uses you to get to me. So I believe you, and you've told me that if you change and you do these things, you're going to have a better life. And so I was excited at the same time with change as I was afraid of it. Because I knew if I tried to get different, that it would be different. And anything was better than what it used to be. So there was an excitement in that change too. And to keep making those amends as they came up. And some of my amends was to stay the hell out of their lives. Don't look that kid up. She's got a life of her own. If it's ever meant to be, she'll be standing right in front of you because that's the way God wants it to happen. But don't go back in other people's lives and stir up stuff. And then to do my morning meditation and my inventory at night. And I remember Chuck Chamberlain one time standing at a podium talking about the 11th step. And he said that 11th step is so powerful that if we could see the light of the 11th step in here, it'd be so powerful it would blind us. And so many times I've forgotten, and I've had to have a sponsor to remind me that the part that I forget about the most in that 11th step is praying for God's will for me and the power to carry it out. And every time I do that, it's there. The power's there, and it gives me the courage to take one more step and trudge down this road one more time. And the 12th step is 3 parts to me. The spiritual awakening is that I'm not who I was when I came in here. That night we went to see that little gal that was moving out of her house. She looked at me and she said, "Right, you're trying to convince me that you were just like me. I haven't taken a bath in I don't know how long. And I just gotten off of work and I had a suit on and I was dressed up." And I said, "I know, that's the miracle." And I remembered Norm A. and Elsa C. telling me, if nothing else ever speaks for itself, let the drapes speak for them. Because if you ever go on a 12-step call, you better look like a lady. Because that's all they're going to see. And I remember that. And I'm so grateful for the old-timers that raised me in this program that taught me the principles to live by, that I never know who I'm going to meet. And I got to be an example of this program everywhere I'm at. A couple of weeks ago, I got to go up to our office in Seattle. And I'm in personnel, and one of our sales reps just got out of an alcohol recovery center. And I got to sit there as a personnel manager and say, you know what, I've learned a lot of things in this line of work about the disease of alcoholism. And along the way, I've been told to read Alcoholics Anonymous book. And it says in there that once an alcoholic gets into recovery, you can expect 110% out of them. And I said, and we're going to expect that from you. And he said, oh, don't worry about it. And he started telling me, you know, I got me a sponsor. It's a guy to call every day. And they told me I have to go to 90 meetings in 90 days. And he started telling me all this stuff. And I sat there and acted dumb and said, that's great. Because you see, I'm an example, not from what I say, but how it's the actions that I take. You know, you've taught me that your actions speak so loud I can't hear a word you say. And he started to tell me that one of the new hires in the warehouse was a friend of his that had been in recovery and tried to get him in the program for a long time. And I said, wait a minute. Don't tell anybody in here about him being an AA. And if you ever see anybody in this company in the program, don't ever tell anybody else in this company, because it's his anonymity. It's up to him to tell. Because I sit there and I thought, I'm going to see you at a convention sometime, sucker. And I loved it. I loved sitting there talking to an alcoholic, and he was excited as a newcomer about recovery, and I sit there and I said a prayer for him, and I thought, I hope you keep it. I hope you keep it. And that's how I practice the principles in my life on a daily basis. I live with that man, and we've gone through humongous surrenders in this program. And every one of the surrenders that we've gone through has brought us closer together. Saying our prayers together. Walking through them and saying, God, thank you for another day of sobriety in our home. Because you see, what I've learned around here, without physical sobriety, there ain't nothing. Without my emotional sobriety, there ain't nothing. And we've fallen in love together because of this program. Our daughter loves us. God, she was home in August, and it's like she grew up in Alateen and went to Al-Anon, and she's still in Al-Anon. She's 29 years old. And 6.5 years ago, she got to move to Milan, Italy. Because she had enough self-worth and enough courage about herself that she chose modeling as a profession, and she moved to Italy, and she's an international model today. And the neatest part, when you talk to her, if she was here today, the things that she'd have to talk to you about that's so exciting in her life is that she's in Italy, she speaks Italian, and she goes to Al-Anon meetings. She's helped them start Al-Anon step studies. She's helped them start Al-Anon speaker meetings. And she sponsors a lot of young Al-Anon Italian gals. And that's the things that she would talk to you about if she was standing here today. And I love her a lot. Last year for Christmas, when she came home, she asked me what I wanted for Christmas. And I said, I want you to go to prison with me. She said, oh, geez, Mom. And she went out there with me. And the inmates loved her. They loved her. Those are the kind of gifts that you give us. When she came home in August, she had her fiancé with her, who's an Italian that doesn't speak English, and he's in our home, and we're trying to communicate. She's translating, and it's great. It's the language of the heart that you've taught us to understand this man. And I know, that I can't communicate with him, and that I try to understand him, and it's like the language of the heart works. And so I just treat him like a drunk. You can't tell drunks much, but you can. But it's the language of the heart and enjoying the personality, And so that's the way we got to communicate in our home, and it was neat. And they got to stay there longer than they needed to or were planned on staying, because some circumstances hadn't worked out in their vacation, and Simone had gotten upset in the very beginning when their plans didn't work out. And they got to stay at our house longer, and when she left, she hugged us and she said, "Isn't it neat? The seemingly bad always turns into something good." And that's the kind of life you guys have given us, Last year at Christmas, Keith asked me to marry him again, because we've been in this program for 16 years, and we were in the active disease for 16 years, and he said, "Babe, I love you. I want to make it right. We're even." And I said, "Not quite." And we got to renew our wedding vows, and both Keith and I work with a lot of young people, and God, we love the young people in this program. And we wanted to be an example for the young people, because we've seen them come in and out of our homes, and we've seen them fall in love, and we've seen them have babies, and we've seen them get divorced, and they just do stuff that everybody does. But I want to be an example for the new people in this program, to the best of my ability. And because of being an example to you and practicing these principles in all of our affairs, Keith and I could stand there that day and renew our wedding vows. And tears rolled down his face. And he stood there and he said, "Babe, I love you." And I remembered seeing him hanging over me, laying on that bed, trying to choke me to death, and thinking, my God, how did we get from there to here? But for the grace of God. And he put my ring on my finger and he said, "Babe, you're my wife, you're my lover, you're my very best friend, but you're not my sponsor." And I put his ring on his finger and I said, "You're my husband, my lover, and my buddy, but you ain't my higher power anymore." And it's that kind of example that I want to be in this program. And I stood there and Keith and I danced to a song, and I remembered the Elsas and the Ramonas and the Arbutuses and the Chucks and the Norms and the old-timers, the Daves, and God. I thought, God, it's taken so many people to get us from there to here. And every person that walks in my life is totally necessary. And because those people were there for me, I looked out when we were dancing and I thought, I got a responsibility to those kids. God gave me the gift of the disease of alcoholism, so I could serve his people. You see, I thought I had it all together when I got here, but I know that together we've got it all. Thank you very much.